Paul Manafort's work in Ukraine becomes U.S. campaign issue. Donald Trump's campaign chief, in his previous role, helped revive a tainted candidate's political standing before Republican Donald Trump picked him to direct his run at the White House. Paul Manafort's last high-profile client was former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, a tainted candidate whom Mr. Manafort helped transform into a winning one, for a time. In Ukraine, Mr. Manafort navigated around the egos of tycoons and politicians. He hammered out a message that was part economic, part tribal, and he shepherded campaigns through rocky times. For Mr. Manafort's allies, his work with Mr. Yanukovych in Ukraine is evidence of his steady hand and skill under pressure. He revived a candidate who had lost a disputed election in 2004. Defeating a political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko, who is known as a fearsome campaigner. For his detractors, the harsh nature of Mr. Yanukovych's rule reveals Mr. Manafort, 67 years old, as a gun-for-hire focused solely on winning, and with no compunction about the nature of his client. Manafort was representing a guy who was up to his eyeballs in corruption and has blood on his hands, said David Kramer, Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute and a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State under George W. Bush. Mr. Manafort's Ukraine work has become an issue for him in the Trump campaign, for which he serves as chairman. Following a report in the New York Times, Ukraine's top anti-corruption prosecutor said Monday that Mr. Manafort's name was in secret records of off-the-books payments made by Mr. Yanukovych's pro-Russian Party of Regions from 2007 to 2012, and that Ukrainian investigators are looking into the ledger. The prosecutor, Artyom Sidenik, said that didn't mean that Mr. Manafort necessarily received any money. Mr. Manafort, in an email Monday, said he has no knowledge of any ledger or payments. The Clinton campaign has pounced on Mr. Manafort's past work in the Ukraine, alleging it is another example of Mr. Trump's unusual ties to Russia. Mr. Yanukovych is now in self-imposed exile in Russia after fleeing mass street protests in Kiev in 2014. GOP candidates and lawmakers are typically much more adversarial with Russian President Vladimir Putin, but Mr. Trump has vowed to try and work with Russia on a range of issues. Mr. Yanukovych was an unsophisticated politician with rough edges. Twice jailed for assault and theft in his youth, Mr. Yanukovych was a lead-in speaker with a tendency to drone on. But he was willing to be coached. Mr. Manafort was initially hired in 2005 by metals and coal tycoon Rinat Akhmedov and tasked with reviving the Party of Regions, described by one U.S. ambassador in a leaked diplomatic cable as long a haven for mobsters and oligarchs. The party's leaders disputed that characterization. Mr. Yanukovych, the party's leader, was at a low point. He had declared victory, supported by Russia, in a fraud-tainted presidential ballot in 2004 that was opposed by mass street protests, known as the Orange Revolution, in favor of a U.S.-backed candidate. He lost a rerun. Mr. Manafort rallied the disparate factions around Mr. Yanukovych, allies say. He was able to have equal relations with all the people around Yanukovych. He was able to unite groups into a whole, said Hannah Herman, then a close advisor to Mr. Yanukovych. He restored the team's faith in Yanukovych. The party won 32% of the vote in parliamentary elections in 2006, and Mr. Yanukovych became prime minister in spring 2009. Months before a presidential election in early 2010, Mr. Manafort helped dissuade Mr. Yanukovych from forming a coalition with rival Ms. Tymoshenko, according to a former longtime Manafort aide. A deal backed by several powerful Yanukovych supporters. Paul picked apart the logic of doing the coalition, dispassionately, unemotionally. He convinced Yanukovych that he could win the election, said Philip Griffin, the former Manafort aide. Mr. Manafort disputed the accuracy of this account. There are parallels between the style Mr. Manafort showed in Ukraine and the combination of deference and assertiveness he has shown in the Trump campaign. Since the departure of Corey Lewandowski as campaign manager before this summer's Republican convention, he has emerged as the clear leader of the Trump campaign organization. Many also see overlaps between Mr. Manafort and his current boss, Mr. Trump. They both play to win at all costs, said K. Reva Levinson, who worked with Mr. Manafort for a decade at his lobbying firm. They both encourage almost a cult of personality. Mr. Manafort's greatest victory in Ukraine came in the presidential election in 2010. Mr. Yanukovych's campaign focused on a platform of economic competence and targeted voters in the south and east by promising to give the Russian language special status and to avoid scuffles with Moscow. The circumstances were favorable. The leaders of the 2004 Orange Revolution, Ms. Tymoshenko and President Viktor Yanukovych, had turned on each other. Ms. Tymoshenko, the prime minister, was battling a 15% drop in economic output in 2009. Mr. Manafort's team held frequent strategy meetings to draw up weekly talking points for Mr. Yanukovych and party speakers across the country, using polling to focus the message and geography of the campaign. Mr. Manafort forged a personal relationship with Mr. Yanukovych, spending hours working with him and playing tennis at his mansion outside Kiev. Allies of both men recall. Mr. Yanukovych became a disciplined candidate who stuck to talking points, allies say. Mr. Manafort said in the email that accounts of his spending many hours with Mr. Yanukovych were an exaggeration and not true. Ms. Herman, who was in charge of Mr. Yanukovych's public communications, said Mr. Manafort was a calming influence when mistakes in the campaign threw the team into panic. He easily and simply found a way to turn things into a positive, she said. He had a positive attitude and took stress away. But once in power, Mr. Yanukovych quickly went off script. Ms. Tymoshenko was jailed, and corruption flourished. In fall 2013, Mr. Yanukovych rejected a trade and political pact with the European Union in favor of an economic package from Russia, sparking protests. The following February, after dozens had been killed in clashes between protesters and police, Mr. Yanukovych fled to Russia. A month later, in March 2014, Mr. Manafort was back in Ukraine exploring involvement in another presidential bid that never got off the ground, owing to divisions among Mr. Yanukovych's former allies. But Mr. Manafort eventually helped rally them into a new party that garnered nearly a tenth of the votes in parliamentary elections that October. Reed J. Epstein contributed to this article. Write to James Marson at james.marson@wsj.com.